name's Ian, and I'm a long-time gamer, having played many different role-playing, war and board games over the years. I have my own campaign world that is at about a 40-year vintage, which has been explored by adventurers using Dungeons & Dragons, RuneQuest, Rollmaster, and various other rules and additions. I'm also very fond of Traveller and Call of Cthulhu games, and, well, eventually I'll get to doing a top however many of rule systems. Someone suggested that I should go down the dark alley of doing a few top videos, so here's the first. Remember, my top is not necessarily going to be your top, and so getting upset that I've said something that you particularly love lower down in the scale, or even not at all, is wasted energy. You're welcome to disagree, but in all things subjective, I am not wrong, and neither are you. So, for the first of these things, I give you my top 30, yes, 30, published adventures for Dungeons & Dragons. This video will deal with 30 through to 11, and then we'll have a top 10 plus some honourable mentions that didn't make the top 30 in a later episode. When I say published adventures, I do not specifically mean adventures or modules published by TSR or Wizards of the Coast, although, spoiler, most of them are. I've drawn this list from all adventures that I've enjoyed over the years. Official modules, adventures published in magazines, licensed works, whatever. The only criteria here is that the adventures considered have seen print and have been reasonably distributed. I've also considered linked series of works as single adventures. So for example, where 2 or more modules collectively describe a single adventure, I've given them a single entry. I am not going to go into all of the adventures in any great detail, and I'm trying to avoid major spoilers. And so, without further rambling, let's get into it. The late 1980s and into the 1990s saw the tie-in between published adventures and novels get even more prevalent. And this was as true for the Dark Sun setting as any other. By the time Dark Sun was released, I was already tired of the concept, so the whole Prism pentad in novels and connected adventures passed me by. Dark Sun, as a setting, was fun, but I had no interest in following the novels through it. Been there, done that. When the DSM series came out, it was refreshing for 2 reasons. First, there were no novels for it, at least that I knew about. And second, it had a unique flipbook presentation, one for the DM, one for the players, that made the adventure series fun and different. The series is only nominally connected, but there is a connecting path through the first 3 towards the 4th. The final adventure, Black Spine, was actually part of the DSE series, but definitely connected back to the 3 DSM adventures. Black Spine did not have the flipbook novelty of the DSM adventures, but it had a huge scope to it, which made for a fittingly epic close to a Dark Sun campaign that took the player characters from 3rd level all the way through to 13th and beyond. D&D players of a certain age waited on tenterhooks for a kosher, true-to-Gyjack's write-up of the most famous of dungeons. But it never came. We had hints, we had material in Dragon Magazine, we had extension modules, but no castle. And then came WG7, Castle Greyhawk, and we all went, what the is this? Sometime later, we got WGR1, Greyhawk Ruins. This was much better, but suffered from painful maps and reams of room descriptions. However, what was in this book was getting closer to a, for want of a better word, true Castle Greyhawk. At least some of the rooms that had been hinted at were here, as were the links to the previously published extensions and areas that fit with the lore from works such as the World of Greyhawk set. But still, it wasn't quite there. However, if you put some effort in, by which I mean redraw the maps, take the time to understand the denizens of the place and how they might interact, and both with the player characters and each other, and the module can be used to build a truly grand epic dungeon delve. Where, to me, Undermountain, that other mega dungeon of D&D fame that has received some attention, fails, and Greyhawk Ruins succeeds, is in what is provided to you as a dungeon master. The Undermountain sets give you some giant maps that are largely unpopulated, and a tedious amount of exploration is required to get anything out of it. Greyhawk Ruins provides compact maps, an ecosystem and structure, and almost constant action of one kind or another. Characters interact with Greyhawk Ruins while they crawl through Undermountain. So you need to put the work in to make it shine, but the material is there, ready to be polished. One form of adventure I like most is where the players are presented with a situation to deal with that then peels away to reveal another underneath, and so on, until the heart of the matter is revealed. With Dwellers of the Forbidden City, we have something like that, or at least the framework for it. The premise of the adventure is pretty usual. Go and find out who's attacking caravans and stop it. Then there's an adventure unto itself in getting to the eponymous city, but from there, anything can happen. Several factions and their relationships are described, and the characters will find all manner of their skills tested while interacting with them. Ultimately, they discover that raiding caravans is simply the tip of the tail. An up and downside to the adventure is that it does leave things in a bit of a cliffhanger. The upside to this is that the DM is free to work out what ultimately happens based on what the characters end up doing in the city. The downside is that could leave a fair bit of work to do. Some helpful guidance is provided, but I do think this module would have benefited maybe from a sequel. Shogun is one of my favourite books and TV shows, and this module, written for the first edition AD&D Oriental Adventures rules, provides a foundation both for introducing players to the idea of an Eastern setting, and more importantly for me, a footing for some Shogun-esque capers. The adventure was set so that Western or Eastern characters could run through it, with the first section of it almost mirroring the rather stormy struggles of John Blackthorne. Subsequent sections present situations and plots worthy of Kurosawa, which are intrepid Western, if using the first section, or native Eastern, if not, characters end up working against. There are so many instances in D&D publications of liberal lifting from works of fiction and movies, and this is definitely one of these. However, unlike some of those, shall we call them homages, this does interesting things with the source, and can provide the basis for a reasonably long, fun, and interesting campaign. Slayers of Lankhmar is probably one of the most Lankhmar-ish adventures across any depiction of Fritz Lieber's famous city in role-playing. Essentially, it's a manhunt, taking place in the countryside outside the city. It also presents a unique take on an adventure, in that the subject of the manhunt and other non-player characters make semi-programmed progress around the adventure's map, which itself is very well detailed. Tricks the manhunt subject may employ to evade his would-be captors are also detailed, and then the player characters must have at it, making their own way around the map, trying to track down their quarry. What happens if they do? Well, that's for the adventure to decide. What it is not is a traditional adventure. There is no room key, and there are no specifically laid out and described fixed encounters. The narrative is not linear, and playing the thing does feel like a sandbox with a purpose. The DM has to be very careful with his time tracking and handling of the non-player characters involved to make it work. The reason why I say it feels more Lankhmar-ish is that many Lankhmar adventures, both those written for D&D and for other systems, feel more like traditional adventures that have been shoehorned into Lankhmar and laced with some of the unique monsters and characters from Lieber's books, rather than scenarios that capture the feel of the setting, at least as it comes off the page to me. A sort of honourable mention to Avengers in Lankhmar. This was a standalone sequel of sorts, set a few years after the events of Slayers, with a different set of player characters. The format of the adventure is similar, except that the concept is layered over the streets and sewers of Lankhmar itself, instead of a wilderness setting. White Dwarf was the staple of any British role player in the 1980s, not least because of its contributions to produce some interesting and fun scenarios for several different games, before it locked down to becoming a Games Workshop-only periodical. The Halls of Tisonthane is a low-level adventure that starts out as apparently normal fare, village being attacked by monsters, go check it out, and it unravels into a plot of feuds and assassination with a twist. Adventures often serve as vehicles to put the spotlight on a monster, new or old, and what you get in the halls, however, is a double shot. There are some new monsters that serve as filler, but there are also two that are very much centre stage here. It is not a straightforward dungeon, and it is an excellent example of how even low-level characters can be presented with intriguing scenarios. There are a handful of adventures that embroil player characters in war, and Red Hand of Doom is, I think, one of the best. Many big war adventures cast the characters in command positions and have them direct forces in a war game-like manner. Others tend to play out the war around the characters, throwing whatever that higher level play ends up putting in their direction. The method Red Hand uses, which I think is the best way to handle large-scale wars in a role-playing framework, is to have the characters operate as a kind of behind-the-line strike force, engaging in a series of mini-adventure missions that aid the war effort of the good guys in the scenario. When they do finally get embroiled in a large-scale conflict, the battle as it affects the player characters is mapped out in a series of waves and missions. The battle itself is simply a backdrop for these. So all the DM needs to do is to run the encounters for the characters while making them feel part of a larger whole with the window dressing. The later Horde of the Dragon Queen and Rise of Tiamat adventures do echo some of the elements in this particular adventure. However, Red Hand of Doom is considerably less of a railroad. Treasure Hunt is billed as a module for levels 0 to 1, which already provides novelty. The way it handles 0-level characters is simply to roll ability scores and select a race, more or less. The basic concept is that at this point in the characters' lives, they have no predisposition towards one class or another. During the course of the adventure, it is the job of the DM to track what each player character does, and through this tracking, at the close of the adventure, the characters rise to first level in the class that best fits. The adventure itself is not complicated at all. This, combined with the 0-level idea, makes it an absolutely ideal tool for teaching role-playing to anyone new to the idea. A minimum number of statistics are used, DM and players are given a lot of guidance along the way, and the scenario is not overblown. So, for an excellent example of an introductory adventure, take a look at Treasure Hunt. The Lost City is another one of those modules that, on the face of it, is just a dungeon crawl. But it is not, far from it. The characters may well start by approaching it as another day at the office, but they will eventually find that bash door, kill monster, nick treasure only gets you so far here. Rather, actually hampers their route forward. As we've seen so far on this list, a lot of adventures from back in the day were left in what can be fairly called an unfinished state, and the Lost City is also one of these. The very lowest levels are mapped, briefly described, and promptly left to the DM to figure out. If you're like me and love tinkering and filling in such gaps, great. If not, well, fine, there are plenty of pre-scripted adventures out there for you to indulge in. On a final note here, The Lost City is one of the modules that Goodman Games has covered in their original Adventures Reincarnated series, and they do a good job of filling in and adding to many of the locations left unfinished in the original. Judges Guild produced a number of excellent supplements for Dungeons & Dragons and other games. The Wilderlands campaign setting itself is something of a masterpiece of simultaneous detail and minimalism, and it's an excellent start for anyone that wants to give a sandbox campaign a go. As for Tegel Manor, it is a ridiculous, haunted funhouse of a dungeon that has to be run for the heck of it. If you take it too seriously, I think you've missed the point. It could be classed as a mega dungeon in a way, but the label Funhouse is a better one. It is whimsical in places, scary in others, and just dungeon crawling fun in still more. Frog God Games redid the adventure for 5th edition through Kickstarter, the results of which are available from their website. Now, see, normally I'm not a fan of dungeons that are just monster zoos, and this, the Caverns of Sochikanth, certainly is. However, each individual component of this adventure, each room of it, if you will, gives players unique challenges to sift through. There are a lot of trick encounters here, too many for this to get into my top 10, such as monsters that look like something they are not, or monsters that look like something they are but with extras, or monsters that, well, let's just say there are a lot. Despite that repetition in broad theme, the adventure still manages to be interesting and exciting, so here it is on the list. The wilderness section of the adventure is largely forgettable, other than providing a link, in the form of gnomes, to the forgotten temple of Tharizdun. The two adventures can be run almost simultaneously if a party wants to take on the denizens of the two dungeons in alternation, or some such. Unlike Tsojcanth, the temple is not so much a zoo. Instead, its denizens are well thought out, and its ultimate theme appeals to the Lovecraft fan in me. The two adventures are not sequels of each other, or even part of the same adventure plot, but it's worth listing them together as two interesting adventure locations within the same area that are well worth exploring. So, Ravenloft. If you've watched any of my other D&D videos, you may get a sense that I don't like this thing, but that is far from the truth. The original i6 module is fantastic, from its maps to the actual adventure content itself. It is also one of the few modules that I've both played and DM'd, so I have experience of it from both sides of the screen. The original Ravenloft is a wonderful shoehorn of gothic horror into the D&D game. A couple of years after i6 came i10, Ravenloft 2, The House on Griffin Hill. This wasn't so much as a sequel as an adventure that can be run in parallel with Ravenloft. Unfortunately, Ravenloft 2 does suffer from some issues of incompleteness, and the plot that is possible to produce when combining the two can drive some players a bit crazy. It needs work to make it work. That's not so true of From the Shadows and Roots of Evil. These two adventures work together off the back of the originals, building on the rivalry between the vampire of Ravenloft, Strahd, and the lich Azalin, who first appeared in Ravenloft 2. They serve as an example of using Castle Ravenloft in different ways, rather than taking the original and fluffing it out with an extra 100 or so pages. Coincidentally, still on the theme of Ravenloft, but this time from the campaign setting, the first adventure that was released for the setting showed just what it could be. There are some fantastic opportunities for role-playing, some great moments of horror, an interplay between domains of neighbouring Dark Lords. It's a lot of fun and represents a height to which the Ravenloft campaign setting rarely reached again. This module can be perfectly synced into another of my favourites, but you'll have to watch my videos to find out what that is. These are two modules published as extension modules connecting to Castle Greyhawk, and they may well be in the list because of my general affection towards the works of Lewis Carroll. That isn't the entirety of it, though. These two modules can be run individually or together, and form a bizarre diversion from the normal adventuring environment that can challenge and hopefully amuse players. The Alice theme is imaginatively woven into the tapestry, often in an unexpectedly lethal way. It is also the one adventure in the entire D&D canon where a chessboard room makes sense. Sort of. The Slave Lord series is one of those staples of Dungeons & Dragons that turns up on everyone's lists more or less. Originally a tournament series, the full-blown series has a variety of challenge, some interesting personalities, and a good element of what I want to call plot escalation to it. The 4 modules have been published as collected works twice, and spawned both a sequel, Slavers, and a prequel, Danger at Darkshelf Quarry, the latter packaged into the recent-ish classic compilation volume from Wizards of the Coast. While I don't think either of these matches the quality of the original, they are still worthy additions to the Slavelord saga. It is worth noting that the celebratory collection includes the original 4 modules, A1, Slave Pits of the Undercity, A2, Secrets of the Slaver's Stockade, A3, Assault on the Area of the Slavelords, and A4, in the Dungeons of the Slavelords, along with A0, in their original format. The previous collected edition, A1-4 Scourge of the Slavelords, published in 1986, was rejigged somewhat in order to make it mesh with the previous year's T1-4 Temple of Elemental Evil. Personally, I don't think this works so well, and the adventures lose something in this translation. That's not to say I don't think they can act as a sequel to the Temple, but I'm not convinced the way it was done with the combined volume works particularly well. You may be getting a feel for my affection for low to mid-level adventures, so it might not be a surprise to those familiar with the classic days of Dungeons & Dragons that this adventure is here. The plot is insidious, as the player characters try to get to the bottom of events, as the sleepy village that they are working to protect slowly turns against them. It is branded as an introductory module, within the N for Novice series, but I think that it is not in the same novice ranks as, say, Treasure Hunt or Keep on the Borderlands. Players new to role-playing may struggle to get to grips with both the plot and the sometimes overpowering encounters that they may face. This is one of those adventures that flits in and out of my top 10, depending on my mood. It's an epic, beginning with the characters hiring on as mercenaries in a frontier village, to a trek across a hostile desert, and into a perilous and unknown realm. While many of the details for the adventure are left to the DM, as usual for this vintage, and in particular for the Temple of Death, the adventure is complete enough to run off the shelf, with a bit of on-the-feet thinking. There's lots of role-playing, straight-up combat, dungeon meandering, and intelligent play folded into this duology, and the way in which the encounters are written in both modules makes it relatively easy to transport to another campaign setting. It is a tough adventure, and characters that tend to throw themselves headfirst into combat will likely fail, terminally. But it is an example of how these early modules manage to pack so much adventure possibility and so much at-the-game table time in so few pages. The wider events and settings surrounding these modules were later expanded in X10 Red Arrow Black Shield, the Poor Wizard's Almanac series, and the Champions of Mystara set. Some help in filling out the area of X5 can be found with Bruce Hurd's excellent Voyages of the Princess Ark series from Dragon magazine. Mixing technology with fantasy has been a staple of fantasy and science fiction for a long, long time. This is exactly what Expedition to the Barrier Peak sets out to do. The dungeon is huge and weird. The equipment the player characters can pick up in the process they must go through to figure out how to use these items effectively are well detailed, and the whole module, for its time, is lavish. An illustration booklet is provided with some of the pictures in colour, which enhances the experience for the players. And finally, this is an adventure, regardless of its official ending, that can be revisited by a party again and again. There is no ultimate bad guy to be defeated. The dungeon itself is both the challenge and the prize, and it's unlikely that a single group will explore all of the place's potential in one run-through. It is perhaps unique in that aspect of replayability, or rather further playability. The Palace is my first instinctive go-to adventure when I am introducing new players into role-playing. It's not always the one I ultimately end up using, as different people have different expectations and learn in different ways, so teaching anything is, in large part, learning about the people that you are teaching. The reason why this adventure appeals so much to me is, as a tutorial, is that it's very self-contained and has a reasonably satisfying close to it. It has little to it to confuse players. Make them think, sure, but not confuse. If you compare it to Keep on the Borderlands, where players are required to make their way through wilderness to the caves and then sort out what the heck is going on within the multitude of mini-dungeons there, not to mention the plots connecting back to the keep itself, then you can perhaps see why the palace's simpler structure makes for a better in to the game. Here, the characters start outside the place they need to explore, immediately you're faced with their first challenge to overcome, and then they're straight into gaming action. No preliminary role-playing needed, and no great stretch of the mind, especially a mind unfamiliar to dungeoneering, as to the direction that is needed. The UK series was developed by, as you might guess, a number of UK-based game designers, largely staff writers for TSR UK. One of the most prolific of these was Graham Morris, whose work might show up again at some point. In this two-part adventure, the player characters get involved in a mystery that then propels them into a conflict between two artifacts. The module depicts a mini-campaign setting and an interesting storyline. Not quite one for beginners, but certainly something to consider for players that have one or two adventures under their belts. And that concludes part 1 of my top 30 published Dungeons & Dragons adventures. I hope you've enjoyed it. Look out for part 2, which will run down 10 to 1, and don't forget to do all of that usual liking, subscribing, sharing and commenting, especially what your top adventures would be and why.